I welcome first Mark Galeotti. He's a specialist in Russian politics and security affairs. Mark Galeotti have two books recently translated into Romanian. I have them here. First, we need to talk about Putin, how the West gets him wrong. And the other one is a short history of Russia from Prince Rurik to Vladimir Putin. But you are also the author of a book about the Russian mafia, the Voris, the Russian super mafia. So Mark Galeotti, let's talk about Russia and of course about Putin. But let me start with a topic from today's agenda. The European Union vaccination campaign. Is Russia really pulling the strings to discredit this European campaign, as we can read in media, for example, or do we give, I don't know, too much power to Putin?
Well, we certainly tend to give too much power to Putin. That's absolutely the fact that we seem to regard him as being the evil genius behind everything that goes wrong, whether it was Donald Trump's election or Brexit in Britain to most recently what's going on with the vaccines. I think what we have to understand is, look, I mean, there is a covert and not always covert political struggle going on between Russia and the West. And therefore, of course, all kinds of Western divisions and weaknesses become exploited and expanded by Russian disinformation. However, we shouldn't, I think, make too much of this. It's not that Putin is sitting there saying, give the Europeans some trouble with this. Much of this is just self-generated. It's that there are various agencies and individuals who know that their job is basically to stir up trouble. And really, they do this pretty much all autonomously. Because let's face it, at the moment, Russia's main interest is in selling the Sputnik V vaccine to as many countries as possible. And actually, this disinformation campaign, you might think helps because it often discredits vaccines, whether it's AstraZeneca or Pfizer or whatever. But on the other hand, by making this into a political struggle, as we've seen in countries like Slovakia, in which actually it becomes very, very politically controversial to basically buy what is, after all, by all accounts, a very successful vaccine. Well, that actually works against Moscow. So I think it's a classic example of almost how the disinformation machine rolls on almost without direct instructions from the Kremlin.
So we can't say that the Kremlin was the artisan of Brexit or the creator of Trump. However, it doesn't mind taking some credit of it or even speculate, as you said, the vulnerabilities. When and how does exactly Russia interfere?
Well, we'll have to think, well, okay, what is it that Russia wants? I mean, I think what they have done is they've realized that their chances of interfering directly in elections to be able to influence the result are pretty much nil. I mean, their impact, obviously, many scholars have looked at their impact on the 2016 American elections. And it's not been possible to prove that it had more than a marginal effect. Likewise, they try to interfere in elections in Germany, elections in France, and each time, not only did they not really succeed, it generated a substantial political backlash. So instead, I think what the Russians have done, they've understood that, look, democratic politics, especially at the moment, are messy, are divisive, are full of all kinds of different disputes. And so instead of actually trying to directly intervene in the outcomes, what they do is take advantage of the fact that all these votes, all these elections generate more discord and try and magnify that. Because what they're trying to do is, look, they have no ideology that they're trying to project. This is not like Soviet times. Putin does not want us all to become Russian Orthodox or whatever. Instead, they want to divide us, they want to distract us, and they want to dismay us. So they want us much more sort of busy competing amongst ourselves so that we can't really pay attention to what Russia is doing. They want us distracted with other challenges and other threats. So again, we don't really notice what's happening, say, in Ukraine. And they want us dismayed so that some of us will think, oh my gosh, Russia is just so dangerous that we need to make a deal with Putin and in a way give him more of what he wants. These are all, I think, the goals.
You demystify in your book Vladimir Putin. But I'm first interested in the layers of his mystification. Is it a Russian narrative, a story that Russia wants to tell to the Western world about Putin, or it is merely a story made in the West that the West choose to believe?
This is a fascinating thing. It's a collaborative fiction. There was absolutely this attempt to portray Putin as much for domestic political reasons as anything else, as this details-oriented, ruthlessly effective master of all he surveys. But the point is that was, I think, primarily intended, as I said, for a domestic audience. You know, we must remember when Putin came to power in 1999-2000, the Russians had had a decade of anarchy, of misery, and of watching their previous president, Boris Yeltsin, become essentially a national embarrassment. You know, a drunk who abused pills, who didn't really have any kind of a vision. So very much there was an attempt to portray Putin in absolutely different terms, that he was instead this focused, rigid, dedicated ex-KGB man with all the facts at his disposal. And it had some success. And that's one of the reasons why Russians still have relatively high approval ratings, though the main reason why they approve of Putin is actually his first decade of power was a very, very prosperous one for Russia and for Russians. However, the interesting thing is that the Russian narrative also appealed in the West because it fit certain stereotypes of the chess-playing grandmaster of geopolitics, of the dangerous antagonist, of the ruthless KGB agent. So, I mean, I think this is one of the fascinating, but also often rather depressing ways in which this myth-making has worked, because so much Western policy is influenced by totally fictional narratives about Putin and how the Putin state works. And so too does so much Russian politics also work on that consensual fiction. And that was one of the reasons for my writing that book, was precisely to say, well, actually, let's look behind the mythology at what really happens.
Too much storytelling and too little diplomacy.
Too little diplomacy, but also too little analysis. And in part, this is one of the results of what had happened. In the 1990s, Russia was no longer, for most Western countries, obviously, you know, it was much less of an issue for them. Obviously, countries that were close to Russia and other post-Soviet states still kept their attention. But, you know, in Britain, in America, in Germany, in France, you saw much, much less attention being given to Russia, much less money going into analysis of the country and so forth. So again, there was basically something of an analysis gap as well as a diplomacy gap.
There is another, let's say, it's dark side of the story that involves the infamous Russian intelligence services. What does Putin look like when seen as the creation of these services? Who controls whom? That's the question that many of us put it.
Well, look, the interesting thing is, I mean, that's a really good question. On the one hand, look, Putin is in absolute control of his system. He can sack anyone he wants. He can appoint anyone he wants. There are no real controls, constitutional or practical. But he's just one man. He's a man with, frankly, a relatively limited grasp of the world. I mean, a lot is made of his KGB background. Remember, he was not an especially successful KGB officer. You know, he was a solid B. You know, good enough, but certainly not one of the high flyers. And he hasn't, you know, since then, he hasn't traveled much, hasn't experienced much. His circle of people he listens to has shrunk and shrunk. Nowadays, he just basically listens to his fellow hawks, who very much feed him a sort of a rather paranoid line about the world. And also, I hesitate to call him lazy, but nonetheless, this is not a man who seems to really be this workaholic of the image. You know, we know that he basically tends to sleep late, gets up, does some swimming, does some exercise, has his breakfast, and then maybe in early afternoon, he gets down to work. Now, in that context, he is all-powerful, but he's also a hostage to those people who brief him, who work for him, and who follow his instructions. I mean, this is one of the really interesting things. If one looks at the people whom he really listens to, especially now with COVID, where most people don't even physically have access. You know, if you are going to meet Putin, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. You have to show that you have a sort of a clear test, that you haven't got COVID. You have to walk through a tunnel of disinfecting spray before you even can get to his room. So, I mean, in that context, he relies on a very small number of people. And so it's these people who kind of paint a picture of the world for him, who tell him what really matters, who tell him what's going on. I mean, in some ways, there is this interesting question of quite who's in charge. And I think in some ways, we do have a situation in which the master of the house is almost a hostage of his own servants,
but in the
because they interpret whatever he does.
But in the same time, he seems to use this old strategy, divide et impera. Because as you said, all these factions of secret services are in a sort of competition.
They are, absolutely. And it's often a very, very kind of carnivorous, cannibalistic even sort of competition. But again, what's happened is, particularly intelligence services, the point of intelligence services ought always to be to give what's called the best truth. In other words, regardless of whether or not the boss is going to like hearing it, they should say, well, this is exactly what we think is really going on. Instead, what has become clear to them is that the boss rewards those who say things that fit his assumptions and his prejudices. So actually, and I think this is something that really does bother me, because, you know, I think Putin is a rational actor. But the trouble is, the most rational actor is only as good as the information that he or she is being provided with. And therefore, I think that, you know, although, yes, there's this divide and rule in terms of stopping any one service becoming all powerful, in practice, they're all competing to basically say the same things to him. And so, I mean, in this context, I think he does have, I would suggest, it's very hard for us to know, but a very, very one-sided view of the world.
The assassination of Boris Nemtsov, of Alexander Litvinenko, the poisoning of Skripal family, the daughter and her father, of Alexei Navalny. All these criminal acts seem to point out to Putin, of course, even though he cannot be directly accused. You talk about this competition that exists in his entourage, you call it adhocracy, to anticipate his desire and to try to please him. But does this make Putin less guilty?
Not at all. I mean, he knows what's going on. Let's take the example of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov as he was walking across a bridge right by the Kremlin. Now, we still don't know exactly what happened, but the balance of probabilities is actually this was not something that was ordered by the Kremlin. It was actually done by Ramzan Kadyrov, the warlord of Chechnya. And it caught the Kremlin by surprise, because Nemtsov was not, it has to be said, a great danger to the Kremlin at the time. I remember talking to someone I knew who worked for the Prosecutor General's office, who said, I mean, that night, everyone's phone was ringing. You know, people being rung up at 3 o'clock in the morning saying, get in there is an emergency. And the interesting thing is that the man they appointed to be the investigator, Igor Krasnov, who is now the Prosecutor General, you know, has a very high reputation within the Russian law enforcement community as a proper investigator. And as soon as he discovered that there was this Chechen connection, he was removed from the investigation, and a second, much more sort of political investigator was appointed. So this was not something that the Kremlin initiated. But after this moment of dismay, once it became clear that Kadyrov was responsible, and frankly, because Kadyrov has many enemies in Moscow, even though a lot of people were telling Putin, look, Kadyrov's got to go, he's gone too far. When it came down to it, Putin opted to cover up the killing, to basically retrospectively sanction it. So although, I mean, I think things like the Navalny poisoning and certainly the Skripal and Litvinenko killings, or attempted killings in Skripal's case, I do believe Putin would have actually had to directly approve those. But even these other killings, he may not have actually ordered someone to pull the trigger. But by creating this system in which powerful people get to kill and get away with it, then he is absolutely as responsible as anyone else.
President Biden said it bluntly. Vladimir Putin is a criminal. It's a very strong statement that leaves little room for other interpretation. Is it because, I don't know, Biden understands Putin better than the others?
I don't know if it's that Biden necessarily understands him better. I mean, you know, we have to recognize, I mean, this was a breach of diplomatic etiquette. This is different kind of language. And I mean, in part, I think it's about the way that actually diplomatic language is changing. Increasingly now, you know, whereas once upon a time, everything that a head of state said would have been carefully scanned and scrutinized by diplomats and all kinds of other bureaucrats. Now they're much more likely to, well, obviously, particularly in Trump's case, tweet out what they think as a response. But I think it's also that it reflects, first of all, the extent to which in the States, the Democrat Party is still very, very angry with Putin. I mean, to be honest, Putin was their scapegoat. I mean, they lost the 2016 elections, and they found that very, very difficult to come to terms with, particularly when they look at Donald Trump. And rather than admitting that, frankly, they had a slightly lackluster candidate and a very, very bad electoral campaign strategy, it's a lot easier to blame the Russians. And I think this is it. I mean, I think, you know, so Biden's own party expect him to be tough on the Russians. But what we really don't know is what's coming in terms of real measures. I mean, so far, the only sanctions that have been brought in following the Navalny arrest and imprisonment were very, very lackluster personal sanctions on a relative handful of Russian officials. It was pretty much the least that the Biden administration could do. So what we don't know is whether Biden was using that language to signal that more serious responses are coming, or actually whether he used the language to distract attention from the fact that nothing much will be happening. Because, you know, from Biden's point of view, there are other priorities: dealing with coronavirus at home, addressing the Chinese challenge, rebuilding relations with Europe. I mean, all these are much more important to him than Russia. So it might be that, you know, he was willing to go along and calling Putin a killer because he knew it would generate a certain amount of sound and fury. And hopefully that would be enough to satisfy the hawks in his own party and indeed in Europe.
Another story. Putin is a killer, so I said enough.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's okay. So you say that we all are focusing too much on Vladimir Putin and not enough on the system in your books. Is Russia really a mafia state? Is this an accurate statement?
I understand why that term has become popularized.
Yeah.
I am enough of an academic and therefore a pedant to not be happy with it, because I think it misunderstands the situation. A mafia state, look, that implies either that the Kremlin runs organized crime, or that organized crime runs the Kremlin. And neither is true. I mean, what we do have is, clearly there's a huge array of deeply corrupt kleptocrats around Putin. Not so much Putin himself, in the sense of nowadays, he doesn't need money. He has all of Russia as his piggy bank. If he wants a palace, he gets other people to build it. He doesn't need money in a Swiss bank account or whatever. But everyone around him.
Money needs Putin.
Absolutely. But anyway, everyone around him is clearly deeply corrupt and involved in embezzling state funds and so forth. The relationship with organized crime is quite an interestingly complex one, because, I mean, we see all the time that we are often very senior gangsters being arrested and imprisoned and such like. It's not as if this is a state that just doesn't even try. It's more that what has happened is Putin has decided that organized crime isn't a priority. When he came to power in 2000, the word went out to the underworld that said, look, you've been basically running wild the last decade, and that's not acceptable because it makes it look like the state isn't in charge. You're going to carry on committing your crimes. The police are going to carry on trying to catch you. That's fine. But if you do anything that looks like a challenge to the state, we will treat you as an enemy of the state and wipe you out. So it was a social contract that just simply said, look, as long as you accept these new rules of the game, you know, the game can continue. And on the whole, the gangsters were willing to accept that. And so this is what we find. It's not actually that the state runs organized crime, but the state defines the limits of sort of acceptable gangsterism, shall we say. So it's a much more complex relationship. But basically, when it comes down to it, the days when the gangsters were more powerful, which is what seemed to be happening in the 1990s, they're over. The state is in charge, and the kleptocrats are the ones who are making the money. But their relationship with organized crime is very much arm's length.
You write a lot about the secret services, and you have your sources inside the Russian secret services. So it's a kind of inside question. Do you think of your sources as whistleblowers, or is just information that certain factions want to use for their own reason? I assume that it's very difficult, to choose which piece of information is manipulation and which is not.
Absolutely. And I mean, I should say that obviously sort of at no point do I in any way solicit or receive classified information. No, I mean, what it is I have people I know who in many cases I've known for not just years, but dating myself decades. And yes, I will happily accept whatever gossip they have. And sometimes, of course, it's likely to be intended to nudge me in a particular direction or just present their own point of view. Because the point is, this is the fascinating thing about looking at this system is there is a huge amount of information swirling around. And in part, that's a side effect of the fact that the inner political system is just so opaque. No one knows what Putin really thinks. No one knows what he says in his closest meetings because the people who are there don't talk, which means that everyone has an opinion and everyone claims to have inside knowledge. And so all you can ever do is listen to all this stuff and see what you can triangulate. What actually fits? What can I find alternative evidence to support? And sometimes it's clear that actually even people who are inside the system don't know, that they themselves are guessing, because again, this is a very, very paranoid, very compartmentalized kind of system. But the point is, everyone likes to talk. Everyone likes to claim that they know something that's going on. And you just sit and listen and assess. And in part also, over the years and again, decades, you generate a gut sense of how you feel this system works. And sometimes you're going to get it wrong. I know sometimes I've got it wrong in making assumptions about what's happening. But, you have that sense of, oh, this doesn't sound right. So I will go and try and dig into it a bit more deeply and see if I can find any corroboration.
Yesterday, yes, I've made an interview with Lyudmila Ulitskaya, the Russian writer, and she told me like this, that she has the feeling that Vladimir Putin wants to stay on the throne until the throne will break. I have two questions here. Does really Vladimir Putin want to be president for life? And the second one, will the throne break after he leaves Kremlin, or the system will collapse too?
I think that I don't believe Putin wants to be president for life in the sense of doing the job. If anything, he seems himself increasingly detached, even before coronavirus, increasingly bored. He used to, for example, travel the country a lot. He would do this kind of classic good Tsar thing of, let's say, some place, some region somewhere in the Russian Far East or whatever, where there's some big problem and the locals are up in arms. And then suddenly Putin would arrive and he'd give the local governor or a mayor a public ticking off and there will be money. And he would very much kind of bring this notion that ultimately Putin is the good Tsar who's on the side of the people, and it's the bad boyars, the aristocrats, people who actually run the country. Well, they're the people who are to blame for everything. He used to do that a lot, very much less common these days. Likewise, he's just much less kind of connected with day-to-day management of the country. And, even when he has his big major sort of interaction with his own people, this direct line event, sort of an annual event where people from all around the country can send in questions and so forth. Nowadays he just looks so miserable through most of it. As again, Alexei from Omsk asks him a question about, I don't know, cattle quotas or something. that I think he's, in a way, it's not fun.
Mm.
But when you create a system which is so personalized, in which law doesn't really matter, in which power is everything, he faces the same problem as, frankly, any mafia chieftain. You know, everything you have, everything you own, all your security, your personal security and that of your friends and cronies, depends on you being in power. The moment he steps down, he becomes a hostage to whoever succeeds him. So if he's going to step down, I think he'd like to, he needs two things. One is he needs a successor he genuinely feels he can trust.
Mm-hmm.
And the trouble is, this is not a man who trusts easily. I mean, if you look at most of his cronies, these are people who, frankly, he knew either in his childhood or in his early adulthood. And secondly, he needs some kind of political position. So in some ways, again, he still needs a little throne. Something that gives him authority and immunity and still a role in the political system,
Mm-hmm.
but without having to handle the day-to-day work. So I think that will be his ideal. He might not be able to get it, though. But if he ever finds that successor, he'll take it. But in terms of your second question about whether the throne will break, I don't think it's going to break in a dramatic way.
Mm-hmm.
I think actually, I mean, I don't think this system will survive in its current state after Putin. It's just so built around the shape of Putin. But on the other hand, there will be a sort of a powerful elite that want to make sure that there's no dramatic change. So I think actually what we'll see is a process of generational reform. I think the next generation of elites, they're much less nationalistic. They're much less invested in Russia's place in the world. It's very much something of Putin's generation, the people who went through the collapse of the Soviet Union and haven't really managed to come to terms with the end of empire. Next generation, they're just pragmatic kleptocrats. They want to be able to steal at home and bank abroad. They want better relations with the West so that they can come and buy their fancy penthouses in London and send their kids to American universities and all that kind of thing. So they'll probably improve relations with us, but they'll still be kleptocrats. Maybe the political generation after that will be more democratic. So over the years, the throne won't break, but maybe it'll become a bit less throne-like and a bit more just a chief executive's chair.
So you said that Vladimir Putin wants for him a successor who can guarantee him the same arrangements he made for Boris Yeltsin.
Absolutely. And he was a pretty loyal client of Yeltsin's in that respect. He did look after Yeltsin. He did look after the so-called the family, which was his inner circle. But again, it's a big leap of faith. And again, I don't almost feel that Putin has got anyone yet. He's clearly been sort of experimenting and testing people. Mm-hmm. His former Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, for example. But he hasn't yet found anyone that he feels he can trust. He's still, I think, victim, again, we're going back to mythology, victim of his own myth, mm-hmm. and that sense of himself as the indispensable man.
Mm-hmm. There are books about dictators' paranoia, for example, dictators' fears.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're a good reason. I mean, I don't know how far, I think it's been, again, overblown. But there is this story about that Putin became obsessed with what happened to Gaddafi in Libya. I don't believe stories of him sort of obsessively playing footage of Gaddafi's death or anything like that. But certainly from his point of view, there is that awareness that, if he does not manage the process really carefully, he'll end up in prison, handed over to a war crimes tribunal in The Hague or whatever.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, you write, I don't know where, but you write that the Russians felt like being a part of Europe, but it was an illusion that vanished very quickly. When did Europe stop seducing them and why? It is Europe.
Well, I think we have. Sorry, I think we have to think of, in a way, there is Europe and there is Europe. There was a very recent opinion poll in which actually a declining number of Russians said that they believed that their country was part of Europe. But you've got to realize that when Russians talk about Europe, in some ways, they're using Europe as a metaphor. Mm-hmm. what they would think of as a sort of a normal way of life, a way of life in which your vote matters, that you can set up a business without someone coming and demanding money or taking it over, that you can express your opinions without having to worry about what the state is going to feel. All these kind of these sorts of rights that we take for granted, this sort of way of life we take for granted, and also European means exactly having a car and having a nice apartment and a certain quality of life in that respect. That's separate from, shall I say, Europe, the political structure, the European Union and so forth. I think the point is Russians still regard themselves as culturally and historically European, and they are. In the 1990s, there was also this over-optimistic sense that Russia could become part of Europe in the sense of whether it's the European Union, or even there was talk of Russia joining NATO, which is always, frankly, a non-starter. And from the Russians' point of view, I think they felt that Europe abandoned and betrayed them. Now, look, in fairness, at the time, Europe was particularly focusing on the countries of Central Europe, the Warsaw Pact countries, the Baltic states. These are the ones that are obviously being sort of fast-tracked for integration. And from their point of view, look, they didn't also have the time and effort and resources to be thinking about Russia. And also America, I think, dramatically mishandled its relationship with Russia in the 1990s. Again, took it for granted, didn't really appreciate just what a psychological blow the end of empire can be. I'm speaking to you from Britain. How much of the Brexit vote was because Britain hasn't really come to terms with the end of empire and the fact that it's no longer this sort of special global nation?
Look at Viktor Orban, at the Hungarian people, it's the same.
So in that context, yes. So in that context, if we look at what happened, I think the Russians got disillusioned with Europe, but not, as it were, with the idea of Europe. But they just felt that they had been betrayed. And the reason why it's so bitter is precisely because, in a way, they feel that it's family. The Russian relationship with China is wholly pragmatic. The Russian relations with most countries is that, if there's alliances, that's great. Europe, though, actually that is so much more important to Russians because they regard themselves as Europeans, and therefore they feel that this was family that turned its back on them rather than just some neighbors. So I think it's a much more complex thing. So, and I think we're going to find it sort of continuing to ebb and flow. There are times when the Russians will feel closer to Europe, times when they feel more betrayed by it. But always, they ultimately feel that they are part of Europe.
In your book about Russia, about the history of Russia, you talk about this attempt to rewrite the history and to build those myths that give the Russian the feeling of being a superpower. Up to a point, all national identity construction looked like this at one moment in their history. What is different in Russia?
Well, what's different in Russia, I think, first of all, it's that this is something that really has been a constant theme throughout Russian history. Even if you look at the very start of what we think of as the Rus, when you had adventurers, the Vikings from Scandinavia coming down and conquering, and that even then was being spun as, no, we Slavs invited them in. We said this land is great, but we have, enriched, but we have no order. Come and rule over us. So right from the very first moment, you actually had, immediate history being rewritten, and that's been a trend throughout. And I think particularly for Russia, it's been important because Russia is this very, very varied country. It has no natural borders. It's constantly expanded and expanded, sometimes by design, sometimes by accident. It contains, all these different peoples. It's not just Russians, let alone Russian Orthodox. It's Muslims of the North Caucasus and Tatarstan. It's the sort of indigenous peoples of the high north and Siberia, etc., etc. And so there's always been this attempt to think, well, how can we create some identity that can unite all these people? And, Tsarism and Orthodoxy were obviously problematic because they excluded other people. The whole Soviet idea, that was part of the sort of the design of the Soviet Union, was that it provided a structure in which everyone could come under the same roof. Now, this has been sort of turbocharged by Putin's desire to create a narrative that explains and justifies his policies. As I mentioned, in the early years of Putinism, he had legitimacy because he was delivering on his promises. He basically, again, his social contract with the Russian people was this: you stay out of politics, and in return, we'll guarantee that your life will get steadily better. There will be, more holidays and a better car and a nicer flat. And more to the point, your kids will have an even better life than you. And Russians were fine with that, frankly. Since, even before 2014 and Crimea and the sanctions that followed, actually the Russian economy has been not stagnant, but certainly not growing at the kind of rate it would involve. And because of all the embezzlement and so forth, ordinary Russians' quality of life has actually been declining. And they feel it, they understand it, and they feel betrayed. Well, look, there's nothing Putin will do about that. He's not going to suddenly cut his military spending. He's not going to suddenly pull his troops out of the Donbass to try and remove sanctions or whatever. So instead, Putin's turning to a different way of trying to legitimate himself and say, look, yeah, times are hard, but what you need to understand is that basically the outside world is hostile. The world hates Russians. And that's why we're this beleaguered fortress. And our history tells us that if we are not united, we will be beaten. So that's why we all have to pull together and obey one single powerful leader, which happens to be me. So this is why I think there is a really strong political dimension to Putin's attempt to rebuild history and cherry pick the bits of past history, Soviet, Tsarist, pre-Tsarist, that fit his narrative, because it's an attempt to try and legitimize himself. It's failing, but it's what he's trying to do.
You say that Putin doesn't have an ideology. It doesn't exist a Putinism. But what role plays, for example, the church? Because you were talking about the Orthodox Church.
In many ways, I have sort of flippantly said that in some ways the Russian Orthodox Church really ought to be considered just another nationalized industry in Russia, because basically it has accepted a role as a subservient arm of the state. It gets all kinds of perks and privileges. Senior church figures live very, very well indeed, as we've seen from their Rolex watches and their limousines. But in return, its job is to provide ideological support for the Kremlin. And we've also seen, church figures blessing military bases and forces in Crimea, and generally sort of supporting the Kremlin line. This is a pragmatic alliance. But the interesting thing is that, although Putin himself is a Russian Orthodox Christian, by all accounts, a genuine believer, it's not just a political pose. But nonetheless, this is still a multi-confessional country. They have recently unveiled this huge new mosque, for example, in Moscow. If you go to Tatarstan, which is one of the powerful constituent republics, you go to the Kremlin in the capital, Kazan, and there is a huge and glorious mosque right next to a Russian Orthodox cathedral. And that's a pretty fitting metaphor for how Russia works. So I think, again, this is the way that Putinism works. He's created what I've sometimes called a mobilization state. He feels that Russia is essentially at war as it desperately affirms its status in the world. It doesn't mean to say Russian tanks are ever going to be rolling into Europe or anything like that, but a political war. And in that war, he regards it as a responsibility of every Russian to do their bit for the state. So that's why you see national corporations being expected to, whether it's contribute money to the Sochi Winter Olympics or whatever else. And likewise, the church's job is to support the Kremlin. And so long as it does that, it gets all kinds of privileges.
Like secret services. It's a part of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. These are all just simply arms of the state.
So why do you think that the West failed in Navalny case? It is because it didn't try hard enough, or is it because Navalny is too important for Putin, more important than others political opponents he had?
I mean, this is always the problem, because obviously this matters a lot more to Putin than, if we're brutally honest, it matters to the West. You know, we would like to see democracy in Russia. We would, above all, like the Kremlin to stop trying to kill its political opponents. But on the other hand, we have a lot of other things on our mind. And let's be perfectly honest, we are often very inconsistent in that. I mean, we pay a lot more attention to what happened to Navalny than to what's happened to 1 million Uyghurs in China, or how the journalist Khashoggi was murdered and dismembered inside the embassy, and the Saudi embassy in Turkey.
Russia has a more powerful story.
Russia has a more powerful story, but also, you know, we want cheap goods from China. We want cheap oil from Saudi Arabia. You know, we have to understand, unfortunately, there is a high level of political pragmatism at work. But there's also this problem about, I think, that the West hasn't really got a handle on how to really bring pressure to bear on the Kremlin. We tend to default back to sanctions because it's the tool that we know and that Western governments feel comfortable with. Individual sanctions on specific people, I mean, that has a role. But the idea that it's really going to have a dramatic impact, if we really want it to have a significant impact, we need to be hitting a lot of people with sanctions. Not 6 people, but 60 or 600 people. We need to be basically saying, look, if you are a senior figure within the Russian security apparatus, for example, not just the general that was behind this particular poisoning, but, you know, anyone who's, say, lieutenant colonel or above rank or whatever, you and your family are not welcome here. But we also needing to be thinking more imaginatively about how we essentially show that there are costs to the Kremlin. We can't ever stop the Kremlin from doing what it wants, especially within Russia's boundaries. All we can do is slightly alter its calculus and say, look, you know, we would like to do this, but we know that there are going to be costs. Is it still really worth doing? I mean, for example, with just to take a few, I mean, and I'm sure there are many more possibilities, you know, with the Navalny case, what we could do is say, well, actually, you know, we are going to, you know, basically provide resources for emigre Russian news agencies, which exist and are very, very effective in highlighting what's really going on in Russia, to allow them to continue to do their work. Or maybe what we actually do is make it clear that something that is totally asymmetrical. For example, you know, we know that what happens in Moldova, in Georgia, in Belarus, and in Ukraine matter a lot to the Kremlin. So maybe what we would say is, look, just watch out. You know, if you do this again, we are going to, I don't know, give the Georgians 5 million euros to support their counterintelligence efforts. Or we are going to bring pressure to bear on Russian attempts to penetrate Moldova. You know, the problem is we tend to get very, very symmetrical. We tend to sort of think, oh, well, you know, if it's about Navalny, then we can only respond in similar terms. The Russians are very, very holistic. They look at, you know, again, if we want to use the old cliche of the chessboard, they look at the whole board. And therefore, sometimes if you see a pawn being taken on one side of the board, well, maybe your best response is to move your knight on the other side of the board.
So even Putin plays judo, we have to play chess.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, but the thing is, we have to be less predictable. Okay. We are just so predictable for the Russians, and they actually do respond when they're caught by surprise because they don't like that feeling.
During the pandemic, Russia and China, because you mentioned China, had very compatible narratives. They both promoted the idea of lack of solidarity, for example, within European Union. Can we talk about, I don't know, coordinated messages?
Sometimes it's coordinated. More often, I think it's just convergent because they both spot the best opportunities. I mean, again, if one actually looks at the narratives, it's quite interesting because the Chinese narrative was above all about, nope, it's not our fault. They were very, very hostile to the notion that somehow this was the Chinese virus. And this has actually led to, I think, a general, much more aggressive turn in Chinese geopolitical thinking. And I think, even as and when, hopefully sooner than later, the COVID crisis recedes, I think we're still going to see a much more aggressive China than we saw in 2019. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Russian narrative was really much more, I think, opportunistic about, well, we happily will exploit any particular areas of division. Mm-hmm. This just happens to be the next available sort of particular sort of pressure point. But the interesting thing is, I mean, at first, they actually tried to use positive soft power. We had these From Russia with Love aid missions to Italy, to Serbia, and even to the United States, which could have been very effective. And I think this is a classic way in which, the way in which Russia is much, much less rigidly controlled than we often think manifested itself. Because there were trolls and propagandists who were still putting out very kind of toxic messaging. At the same time, the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Emergency Situations were trying to make these kind of very positive, we're all in this together, common humanity messages. And it's in effect, the trolls ruined the Foreign Ministry's efforts to gain any kind of positive message. Mm-hmm. So in this respect, actually, it was just the two different arms of the Russian state that were fighting and essentially neutralized anything positive from that. Mm-hmm. So I think it shows actually that the Russian state is much, much less well coordinated than we might think. But the point is, the fact that the Chinese and the Russians both emphasize this lack of solidarity, to be brutally honest, the reason that they could do that is because at first there was a lack of solidarity and coordination within the European Union, and arguably there still is. Mm-hmm. This is the point. We give our enemies, the Russians, the Chinese, whoever, the ammunition. They have no magic mind control powers. They can't create divisions where none exists. All they can do is spot the divisions that we allow to emerge and do their little bit to help open them up further.
Like in judo, as you write. This is my last question. When reading your book about Putin, I couldn't help thinking at Viktor Orban as well, because the same pattern of controlling a country with his camarilla, his friends, a democracy without constitutional liberalism, so the so-called illiberalism. It's a new word of political science. Of course, Putin and Orban have different background and different affiliations. Is it a little bit paradoxical for you that Viktor Orban has a model in Vladimir Putin, knowing that after ca-ntr-un, after the Second World War, Russia is the second big trauma for Hungarian people?
Mm. It is a definitely a very depressing sight. But again, I think that in some ways it's more that I think this authoritarian populism has a particular stance. I mean, to be perfectly honest, although the F word, fascism, gets thrown about much, much too easily, and certainly I see no parallels with Nazi Germany. But, if one looks at Mussolini, I think there's some quite interesting similarities in how they actually effect state capture, and even just simply how they manage their propaganda and then their image making and use enemies, whether it's Navalny or whether it's Soros, as a sort of focus for creating kind of a political platform. So, I mean, I think there are just certain commonalities. Of course, the big difference is that Hungary, for all that it is a maverick state within the European Union, nonetheless is within the European Union. Mm-hmm. There are more solid institutional safeguards. And although you might say Orban is able to often get his way around them, it's a constant effort. There is in some ways a sort of a natural institutional pressure against him, which he is constantly having to push against. Unfortunately, in Russia, there hasn't yet been the opportunity to build up those kind of healthy institutional structures. They kind of one can see certain elements and forms, but it's still much, much more primordial. And so I think that for me is the big difference. Viktor Orban is in many ways much more effective than Putin. But the point is, he has to work harder to maintain his control over the system than Putin. Putin can rely on in a way, momentum.
Okay, thank you very much for this
My great pleasure.
interview.